So let's talk about Model 2. Here we're looking at really the essence of bureaucratic organizations, and the primary unit of analysis is the organization. And the model is labeled the organization behavior model. Here you see, if you took public administration, a lot of Weber's ideas. At first, the chapter begins with this idea that organizations are very hierarchical in structure, and that in a traditional model you would expect the CEO at the top to be sending orders down through the organization, and then the organization reporting back up the hierarchy. The idea here is that there is a systematic organization of power within each organization, and that typically decisions are made by an organization in this very orderly, systematic, hierarchical fashion. Now, there is also the allowance, though, that in some cases you have to have multiple organizations involved in the process, and then that gets a little bit more complicated as each is operating on their structures and rules, and their outputs from their organization come from those procedures and rules. And that the decision then is this clustering of hierarchically structured organizations rulemaking. However, organizations are complicated. They are oftentimes not strictly hierarchical. There are power flows in an organization that go against the standard written on paper structure. And Allison recognizes that at times, and some scholars have been critical of him that at least in the theory section, he maybe should have stuck more strictly to a very hierarchical arrangement. He understands, though, that oftentimes organizations do not function in that strict hierarchical fashion. At times when you're reading chapter 2, then, you're starting to feel a little bit like you're already in the Model 3. And that is where the book has gotten some criticism, that 2 and 3 have a little bit more overlap than they think was necessary. In Model 3, you have the government politics model, which is more often referred to as the bureaucratic politics model. In Model 2, the organization is the unit of analysis. In Model 3, it is the individual actor or player, most of whom are operating from an organizational vantage point. And so they have a position in the system, and they get to play in the system, oftentimes based on what are the rules of who gets to be invited to various meetings. This is especially true of interagency operations where you have multiple agencies involved, and there are precise entities who've been invited to make up this larger interagency task force. Unless you have a seat at the table, it's harder to be a player in that game. Sometimes he refers to the process in Model 3 as a game, and he sees each of these players as coming with a vantage point, affected by the organization they work for, affected by their educational background and other elements that impact their point of view and their personality and how they go after getting things done. And so he identifies that each of these individuals is trying to do what they can to move an agenda forward, and that ultimately many of our governmental decisions aren't really a single decision, but rather the movements of many different players, and that this chaos comes together as a resultant, what he calls a resultant. And the resultant is the actions of each of the players, and he says that ultimately then governmental action doesn't always presuppose intention. I think the response to the coronavirus is really a very good example of this, where you've got all of these parts of government as well as actors outside of government that have clout who are doing what they can to help respond to COVID-19. But it is not a single dimension, well orchestrated, coordinated process or decision. And unfortunately, in complicated governments, that's probably the model that plays out most often.